12. The lamp was turned down so low I could barely see the pattern on my grandmother's quilt. November cold pressed flat against the window glass, and downstairs I could still hear them. The clink of plates being carried to the kitchen, the low murmur of ants, the scrape of a bench being folded and leaned against the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed in my dark blue dress, and I did not move. The door opened. He stepped in, and for the first time in my life, he spoke to me. Just to me, in a room with no one else listening. I had married this man that morning, and I had never heard his voice before. My name is Sarah, and this channel is a place for the stories no one prepared me to tell. If something in these words feels familiar, if you know what it is to live beside someone and still feel unseen, stay a little while, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and tell me in the comments, did anyone ever prepare you for the person you were going to become? I grew up in a house full of sound, 7 children, a father who prayed in Low German before every meal, a mother whose humming filled the kitchen the way bread fills a room when it's baking. There was noise everywhere in my childhood. But underneath all of it, there was a particular silence between my parents that I didn't understand until I was much older. My father rarely spoke directly to my mother in front of us, not from coldness, not from cruelty, from something our community called Gelassenheit, a yielding, a submission to something larger than yourself. Love in my world did not need to be spoken to be real. It was assumed. It was demonstrated through staying, through working, through showing up to the same table every morning for 40 years. Words were almost beside the point. I was 16 the first time I saw him. It was a Sunday singing, the kind we held in barns after the evening service, long tables pushed together, boys on one side and girls on the other, lantern light moving in the draft from the high doors. We sang from the Ausbund, the old hymnal, hymns so ancient some of the words had worn smooth from centuries of use. No harmony, no individual voices allowed to rise above the rest. Everyone submerged into the same sound, the same slow cadence, the same breath. I noticed him across the table not because he was loud or restless, the way some boys were trying to catch a girl's eye. I noticed him because he was still. His stillness had a kind of weight to it. I watched his mouth form the words of the hymn, and I thought. I could not tell you then what I thought, only that I kept looking back. After the singing, he asked through a friend if he could drive me home. That was how it was done. You didn't ask directly. The message came sideways, through someone trusted. I said yes. We sat side by side on the buggy bench in the dark, the horse's hooves steady on the gravel road, a single lantern swinging from the front post, throwing orange light across the ditch weeds. He spoke. He asked about my family's garden. I told him about the tomatoes. We'd had a good harvest that year, better than the year before. He said that was good to hear. There was a silence. Then he said the weather had been kind. I agreed. Another silence. The horse kept walking. By the time he stopped the buggy at our lane, we had exchanged perhaps 40 words. I climbed down. He waited until I reached the porch. Then the buggy moved on into the dark, and I stood there listening to the sound of wheels on gravel growing smaller, and I thought, I know his voice now. I can pick it out in a crowd, but I do not know what it sounds like when he isn't being careful. That distinction, the careful voice versus the real one, I didn't have words for then. I only felt it as a kind of hunger I couldn't name. Over the next months, he drove me home from singings 5 more times. He visited on 2 Sunday evenings when the arrangement was more formal, sitting in the front room with my parents nearby, talking about crops and community news and the new bishop's preaching style. He was polite. He was measured. He was exactly what a young man was supposed to be. And I sat across from him thinking, there is a person behind those careful words. I have seen flashes of him. The way he laughed once at something his friends said, sudden and unguarded before he caught himself. The way he looked at the field sometimes, not working, just looking, with an expression I couldn't read. I wanted to know that person. There was no path in my world that led directly to him. There was one night, before the wedding, when I almost heard him. I'll come to that in a moment. But first you need to understand the bundling visits, because they are the part that most confuses people who did not grow up the way I did. In some communities, not all, but mine, There was a practice of a young man visiting a woman in her room after her family had gone to bed, both fully dressed. A rolled quilt placed between you, or sometimes just an understanding. The idea was that you could speak more freely in the dark, more honestly than you could at the supper table with parents watching. In practice, at least in my experience, what happened was something stranger. We were physically closer than we had ever been. I could hear him breathing in the dark. I could smell the lye soap on his skin, plain and clean. And we spoke less, not more. There was too much awareness of the other person's body, too much consciousness of the rule that said this is all it can be. And so we lay there in a kind of suspended silence that was not peaceful. It was held breath. I asked him once in the dark whether he was nervous about being married. He said quietly that he supposed he was. I waited for more. It didn't come. The almost moment happened on a Wednesday evening in September, 2 months before the wedding. We had both attended a church gathering at a neighboring farm. Afterward, walking back toward the buggies in the early dark, we were briefly, accidentally alone. Everyone else had moved ahead or peeled off toward different lanes. We were behind the barn. He stopped walking. I stopped too. He turned toward me, and something crossed his face that I had never seen there before. A kind of gathering. Like a man about to say something he has been carrying for a long time, he opened his mouth. And then his younger brother came around the corner of the barn calling his name, loud, cheerful, oblivious. And whatever had been about to happen folded closed like a book. He looked at me. I looked at him. He nodded slightly. I nodded back. We walked separately to the buggies, and nothing was said, and I told myself it hadn't mattered. I was lying to myself. It mattered enormously. The engagement was announced on a Sunday after service, and after that, silence became impossible in a different way. Suddenly, there was no quiet at all. My mother and her sisters began sewing immediately. My dress, the table linens, the covering for the benches. Celery was planted in long rows in the garden because celery was the wedding vegetable, served creamed and in salads, and as a centerpiece on every table, so much celery that the whole yard smelled faintly of it in the damp mornings. The house was painted. My father and brothers built 2 extra tables in the barn. I barely saw him for 6 weeks. When I did, it was always surrounded. Family on all sides, tasks pressing in from every direction. The machinery of tradition running so efficiently that there was no gap in it for 2 people to simply be. I realized one morning, hanging laundry in the cold, that I was going to marry a man whose inner voice I had never heard. Not his real voice, not the voice that comes out in the dark when no one is performing for anyone. I had never heard that, and in 3 weeks I would be his wife. I didn't tell anyone what I was feeling, because I didn't know how to explain why it was a problem. In my world, what I was describing wasn't a problem, it was just marriage. You didn't need to know a person's inner life before you joined it to yours. That was what marriage was for, the slow learning of another person across decades, the gradual unveiling. My mother would have looked at me with patient confusion if I had tried to explain the particular ache I was carrying. She would have said, "You will know him, give it time," and she would have been right in her way. But something in me, the part that had watched him looking at the fields with that unreadable expression, the part that had felt the weight of that almost moment behind the barn, that part was not willing to wait without fear. I carried the fear the way you carry a stone in your apron pocket, present, constant, heavier at the end of the day than at the beginning. His ceremony began at 8 in the morning and did not end until nearly noon. Backless wooden benches in my parents' front room, every wall between the downstairs rooms removed the week before to make space for 200 people. The bishop's voice filled the room in High German, slow and unvarying, the same cadence it had held for generations before either of us was born. At one point, he and I were taken to a side room for private counsel, but even this was not private the way I had hoped. The bishop spoke. We listened. We were asked questions, we answered. Our voices were public instruments that morning, performing the responses the community needed to hear, confirming that we understood the covenant we were entering. When I said ja to the vows, My voice came out steadier than I felt. His did too. I heard it clearly across the small space between us. Steady, measured, careful. Still the careful voice. Still the public one. After the ceremony, I was moved through the day like something precious and borrowed. 200 guests sat at long tables eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes and creamed celery, and I smiled until my face felt separate from the rest of me. I was guided from table to table, congratulated, embraced, handed small gifts wrapped in plain paper. Women I had known all my life pressed my hands between both of theirs and looked at me with expressions I could not fully read. Warmth, yes, and something else underneath it, something careful, something that knew things it wasn't going to say. My new mother-in-law hugged me for a long time without speaking. I remember the smell of her, lavender water and wood smoke, and the firmness of her arms, and thinking, she knows something about this night that I don't know. I did not eat much. I don't remember eating at all. By late afternoon, the light had gone gold and long across the yard, and I was exhausted in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. It was Sarah who found me near the end of the evening. Sarah had married 2 years before me to a man from a neighboring district. She was 23 now, already a mother once, the kind of woman who had learned quickly how to move through a room without taking up too much space. She pulled me aside near the kitchen door in the narrow passage between the warmth inside and the cold evening air, and she said something that I have never forgotten. She said, "The first night, he turned off the lamp and went to sleep. He didn't say a word, not one word, and I lay there thinking, this is it, this is what I waited for." Her eyes were dry. Her voice had the flatness of something that had already finished hurting. She wasn't confessing. She was just telling me a fact, the way you tell someone the temperature or the time. Then someone called her name from the other room, and she squeezed my arm once and was gone. I stood in that narrow passage for a moment, the warmth on one side and the cold on the other, and I turned her words over and over in my hands like a stone that won't sit flat, no matter how you place it. I want to be careful here about Sarah's husband, because it would be easy to make him a villain in this story, and he wasn't. He was a man shaped by the same silence that shaped all of us. He had grown up in a home where his father didn't speak to his mother in private, either, where love was demonstrated through labor and presence and the absence of cruelty, and where the idea that you might sit across from your wife on your wedding night and simply talk, simply open yourself to her and ask her to open herself to you, that idea had no template, no model, no permission. He wasn't withholding from Sarah out of coldness. He was doing the only thing he knew how to do. He pulled his silence around them both like a quilt, the way his father had, and his father's father before that, and he believed, I think, that this was sufficient, that this was love. The tragedy was not that he was cruel. The tragedy was that he was simply never taught that there was another way. And that is a different kind of grief entirely. The house emptied the way a room empties of light, gradually, then all at once. Buggies pulled away down the lane in ones and twos, lanterns bobbing in the dark like slow orange stars. My mother squeezed my hand at the door without looking directly at me, a gesture so full of everything she couldn't say that I felt it in my chest for days afterward. My father nodded to me from across the room, the same nod he gave when he was proud and didn't have the words for it. One by one, the family moved upstairs. The house grew quiet in layers. First the outside voices, then the kitchen sounds, then the creak of the upper hallway, then nothing but the tick of the iron stove cooling in the front room. I was directed to the room they had prepared, my old room rearranged, my grandmother's quilt on the bed, a kerosene lamp turned low on the nightstand, a small cedar chest in the corner that still smelled of the lavender sachets my mother kept in everything. I sat on the edge of the bed. I listened to the tick of the stove. I listened to the third stair creak. It always creaked, had always creaked. I had counted on that creak my whole childhood as a warning when someone was coming. It creaked now. His footsteps crossed the landing. The door opened. He didn't turn off the lamp. That was the first thing I noticed. He came in, closed the door behind him, and instead of moving toward the lamp, he moved toward the chair in the corner. The old wooden chair that had sat in that room since before I was born. and he pulled it a few inches forward and sat down in it across from me, with his hands on his knees and his hat already removed. And he looked at me, just looked. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence was different from every silence we had shared before. It wasn't restrained, it wasn't performing patience. It was two people on the edge of something, gathering themselves. Then he spoke. He said he'd been scared. He said that every time he tried to talk to me, really talk to me, the rules were watching his words. The rules were watching, and he hadn't known how to find the gap in them. His voice in that room was softer than I had imagined, younger, a little unsteady at the edges, like a boy trying to sound like a man and not quite managing it. And that imperfection was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. He said my name, my first name, plain and quiet, and it sounded different in this room than it had ever sounded anywhere else, like it belonged to me in a way it hadn't before. Then he said, I picked you because you were the only person who didn't make me feel like I had to be quiet. I did not cry. I did not move toward him. I sat very still on the edge of the bed, and I looked at this man I had married that morning, and I felt something in my chest release, not dramatically, not with a sound, just the way a door releases when the latch finally catches right. I told him I had been afraid he would turn off the lamp. I told him about Sarah. Not the whole of it, just enough. I said, someone told me tonight that her husband didn't speak. Not one word. He was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then he said, that must have been very lonely. 3 words that told me more about him than 40 months of careful courtship conversations had. We talked for a long time after that. Not about important things, not at first. About small things, the garden, the way the ceremony had felt from his side of the room, whether he'd managed to eat anything. At some point, I realized that he was listening to me, not waiting for me to finish so he could assign me a task or redirect the conversation toward something practical, just listening, taking in what I said and sitting with it. In 20 years of life in my community, I could count on one hand the number of times a man had listened to me that way. It was the most intimate thing that had ever happened to me. I want you to understand that clearly. Months later, I understood what Sarah's silence had cost her. It hadn't ended her marriage. She was still there, still working, still faithful to everything the Ordnung required. But something in her had drawn back from her husband, the way a plant draws back from a window that gives no light, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a slow and quiet retreat toward whatever warmth she could find elsewhere. She found it in her children, in her friendships with women, in the particular peace of early mornings before the house woke. She built a life within her life, the way women have always built lives within the lives that were arranged for them. Her husband was not a bad man. Neither of them was at fault. They had both been handed a silence at the beginning and told to call it love, and they had done the best they knew how to do with it. What I kept turning over in the months and years that followed was this. Sarah and I grew up in the same district, followed the same Ordnung, attended the same singings, were married in the same season. We landed in different marriages. And the difference between us was not virtue or wisdom or faith. It was luck, the randomness of that, the sheer, indifferent randomness of it. Felt like the most honest thing I had ever understood about the world I came from. If these stories find you at the right time, if any of this feels familiar in a way you haven't had words for, then stay. I share these stories because no one told them to me. No one sat me down and said, here is what silence can cost you. Here is what a voice can give back. If that's why you're here, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. There are more stories I need to tell, and I need to know you're listening. Gelassenheit was supposed to mean yielding to God. That was its original meaning, the surrendering of self to something holy and larger than yourself. Somewhere along the road from that original idea to the world I grew up in, it had also come to mean yield your voice, yield your questions, yield the part of you that wants to be known rather than simply useful. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it the way you describe weather, as a condition you lived inside that shaped you without your permission, that you only truly understood once you were standing in a different kind of air. My husband gave his voice back to himself that November night, And in doing so, he gave me something I hadn't known I was allowed to want. Not every woman I grew up with received that same gift. I know that now in a way I didn't know it then. I carry it carefully. Some evenings now, after the children are finally asleep and the house has gone quiet in all its layers, he sits across from me at the kitchen table and talks, really talks, and I listen to the sound of him the way you listen to something you were once afraid you might never hear, with your whole self, every time like it's the first time. That is what his voice gave me, and I have never once taken it for granted.